A few months ago, I had a lot of stuff in my personal life going on, and it triggered all my childhood trauma. And I went back to therapy, and I found an EMDR therapist, and EMDR therapy helps you to process the trauma that's stuck in your brain. And you have to go through a trauma timeline before you actually do the EMDR therapy. And a few weeks ago, we were doing my trauma timeline, and my therapist could tell I was getting wound up and agitated. And she said to me, "What are you thinking right now? What are you feeling? What's going on with you?" And I said to her, "I wish the scumbag who molested me was in the room right now. So instead of the violent, bloody confrontation we had last time, I could ask him this time where the fuck it all went south for him. How could he sleep at night abusing young boys? Where did he lose his humanity? Where did hunting children become his passion? And how could he live with himself? How could he have a cup of coffee quietly in the morning and not be eaten alive by what he was doing?" I told her I'll never get a chance to ask those questions, but I want to know just where it all turned for him. My trauma starts in the little town of Stillwater, New Jersey. It sounds calm and peaceful and tranquil. The Paulskill River runs right through the center of town. And it looks like an ideal place to grow up. It's very rural, hunting and fishing and sleigh riding and skiing. We have a ski resort in our county. But we also had evil hiding in plain sight in our county. I had an older brother, 6 years older than me, who was in the Boy Scouts. And his Boy Scout master, Dennis Pegg, befriended our family. And we took him in. My parents owned a restaurant back then, and we had these big Sunday night meals, and he would come over and drink wine. He was lieutenant in the local sheriff's department, and he worked at the county jail as a lieutenant, and he would tell stories about beating inmates. And I was born with a hole in my heart. And at age 6, the doctors came to my parents and said, we've been monitoring Clark for 6 years plus, and his hole has grown to the size of a silver dollar. We have a 6-month window to operate. So at age 7, I had open heart surgery at Mount Sinai here in New York City. And it was a life or death operation. And I have keloid condition where my scars raised up. And my parents were so proud of me for surviving this surgery that they used to have me lift my shirt to all their friends and collect a quarter. And they'd be like, my scar looked like a zipper. They'd be like, "Show your zipper." It was almost like a peep show I was doing. And one of their friends was this scoutmaster / lieutenant, Dennis Pegg. And I had lifted my shirt for him. And it was about 3-4 months after my surgery. It was a hot summer day. And I came in from outside. We had a big patio out back, screened-in patio, a bar, a huge back lawn. And I came in for a drink and to watch TV for a minute. And there was a knock at the door. The TV room was right next to the front door. And I hear Dennis Pegg's booming voice. And I idolized Dennis Pegg. Next to my father, he's who I looked up to the most. He was the scoutmaster. He was the lieutenant. He always had a badge and a gun on him. And I shot up out of my seat and I let him in. And he's like, "Hey, little buddy." And he tussled my hair. "Where is everybody?" And I said, "They're out back." He's like, "Oh, let's sit for a minute." And so we go into the den and sit. And he's like, "I got a quarter for you. Can I see your scar?" And without thinking, I'm like, sure, Den. And I lift my shirt up to my chin. And he goes to me, he goes, how about I give you $1 if you let me touch your scar? I've never seen a scar so raised up like yours. And I'm like, sure, Den. And he takes his big meaty fingers and he starts going up and down my scar. And then he goes below my scar line to my abdomen and he starts probing it right around my belt line. And he's asking me, is your stomach sore from the surgery? And I'm like, no. And after a minute of probing and rubbing, he's like, okay. He's like, here's your $1. He's like, this is our little secret. He goes, we can't be buddies if you can't keep a secret. And I said, I can keep a secret, Den. And he's like, all right, here you go. I'm going to go out back and see everybody. I said, okay. And that was his first physical grooming act. And he had me. The prick had me because I was good at keeping secrets, and that would come back to haunt me. I lived at a lake community in Stillwater called Paul and Skill Lake. And back then, in the early 70s, as soon as you could learn how to ride your bike, your parents told you, be gone and be back at dinner time. And there was a dam area down at the lake. And there was ball fields and basketball courts and jungle gyms. And then you had the lake where you could swim, and there was fishing. And all the young kids congregated down at that dam area. And that became Dennis Pegg's trolling ground. He would spend hours with us fishing, teaching us how to fish, where to fish, how to bait our hook. He would stop by our house all the time, but he did all his one-on-one with me out of the watchful eye of my parents, down at the lake where they couldn't see. My parents told me back then, never get into a stranger's car. They didn't warn me to never get into their best friend's car, who happened to be a predator. At 9 years old, he's inviting me into his pickup truck down at the lake to split a 6-pack of Budweiser canned beers. He tells me a story that his friend just bought a farmhouse and there was an old desk in it. And he opened up the drawers and it was filled with pornography. Come sit in my truck. I grabbed a bunch of the pictures out of the desk. Let's look at them. And he's all giggly and laughing. I'm like, okay. I'm thinking I'm going to see some naked women. I get in his truck and he hands me Polaroid after Polaroid of close-up of penises. And I'm like, Den, where's all the women? He's like, oh, those must have been in the other drawer. I'll get some out of the other drawer next time. Aren't these funny though? Look at these. And I'm like, And he's gauging me and he's testing me. He tells me back then the Marlboro Man was the epitome of cool. He was on the back of every cover. And Dennis is always taking trips out west. And on a trip out west, he tells me he meets the Marlboro Man. And he goes to me, wouldn't you believe it? The Marlboro Man is gay. And it didn't bother me at all. He was a great guy. We hung out for 3 nights and hiked, and we went to dinners, and he was just such a great guy. I don't know whether the Marlboro Man was gay or not, but Dennis is trying to normalize, I think, male-on-male behavior, and he's trying to test me also. And everything, the beers, the Marlboro Man, these are secrets. This is just between you and I. Everything was a secret. And on the other side of Stillwater, on the other side of Paul and Skill Lake, there was another area for fishing. There was fishing all along the river, but it was by the grist mill in Stillwater, an old grist mill. There was a bridge, and Dennis would be like, the fish aren't biting here. Let's go over by the grist mill. Throw your bike in the back of my truck and we'll go over there. Now, Dennis lived just up from the grist mill. Dennis's house sat on a perch overlooking the elementary school, Stillwater Elementary School. he could see when all the Little League baseball games were going on, and he'd come down from his house and stand at the fence and watch all the little boys playing baseball. But Dennis would tell me, throw your bike in the back of my truck, we'll go over to the bridge by the grist mill and fish. And he would always seem to slip in the water, fall off a rock, soak his shoe, or his boot, or his sneakers, whatever he's wearing, and be like, I fell in, I got my feet wet. Come on, we gotta go up to my house. Let me go up and change. And then when we get there, he'd give me a beer. And he's getting me comfortable going to his house. At 10, he starts doing wrestling matches with me. And again, this is our little secret, buddy. He would let me be on top like I'm pinning him. He is a 265-pound hulking monster of a lieutenant in the sheriff's department. But he would let me pretend like I'm pinning him. And then something would switch in him. You could actually see his eyes change, and they would dilate. And he would get aggressive and get me on the ground and get on top of me and start gyrating on top of me. At 11, we end up at his house. And he tells me, let's have a glass of blackberry brandy. And he fills a glass of blackberry brandy up. Chug it down. And it's burning me. And he's like, just finish it. And then take a swig of beer. I'm 11 years old, and he's got me chugging a glass of blackberry brandy and drinking a Budweiser beer right after it. And he's like, we're going to play a game called Bumping Logs. And he's like, I'll be right back. And he goes into his bedroom. And he comes back out, and it looked like he had stuck something down into his shorts. He always wore those cargo shorts with the pockets. And I just thought he had stuck something into his shorts. I'm drunk. I'm 11. I'm trusting of this guy. And he says, stand up. And I stand up, and he pulls me into himself repeatedly. And he's like, your log's not ready yet. Let's get your log ready. And he sets me down on the chair, and he goes, close your eyes, and whatever happens, don't open them. And in the blink of an eye, he slips my shorts off me and starts giving me oral sex. And my eyes instantly open, and he's got his penis out, jerking off. And I'm frozen in fear. I'm gripping the side of the chair, and I can't breathe. And my mind is racing, and I'm paralyzed. I'm frigging paralyzed. And as a grown man, that's what haunted me my whole life, is that I froze whenever he touched me. He finished off, gave me another beer, told me this is our little secret, what happened here today. And to the best of my ability, I just tried to put that out of my mind. If you want to say I was lucky that I didn't live with my abuser. I could go months without an encounter down at the dam area of seeing him. I've heard from so many people that lived with their abuser, and on a weekly or daily basis, they're getting abused, and it's just horrific. At age 12, he concocts this giant story that he needs my help with. And it ends up with me being at his house. And driving to his house, he picked me up down at the lake area. I'm freaking out, going back to the house. And we get there, and the house was boiling. It was a summer day, but the house was excruciatingly hot inside, almost As I look back on it now, I wonder if he didn't have the heat turned on. And we get in there, and he has me chug blackberry brandy. And then he fills it up again. Come on, have another blackberry. And I was so nervous going back to that house, I actually wanted to have a drink. And a Budweiser, my second glass of blackberry brandy. And we end up on his bed. And we end up with our clothes off. And I end up with him behind me in a bear hug with him behind me. And he starts raping me. And I start screaming. And I start crying. I grew up as an altar boy in the Episcopal Church. But in that moment, I wondered where God was. God didn't come to strike this piece of garbage down as he's raping me and I'm crying. I'm screaming, I'm crying. And this fuck whispers in my ear, my 12-year-old ear, just another minute. Just another minute so he can finish himself off. I felt like the only person on the face of the planet. I know people feel alone sometimes in their life. They isolate themselves. At that moment, I felt like I was the only person on the face of the planet. Nobody heard my screams. Nobody came to my rescue. It was just me and this evil entity raping me. And what happened next, to me, was worse than the rape that just occurred. He sat me down, cleaned me up like a nice guy, sat me down at his kitchen table, got me a beer, like two lovers who just, had a great romantic experience and, let's have a beer afterwards. And he had what's called a coon dog. Coon dogs have a long, drawn-out howl. And his dog heard my cries and screams during the rape and started howling and would not stop howling. Dennis went and got his dog, brought it right in front of me, and said, I want to show you what will happen if you ever open up your mouth about what just occurred. And he took his big, meaty fist and he started punching his dog. And I'm screaming, Dennis, please stop. And he's punching. And his dog lay in a heap at my feet. And to me, that was worse than the rape because I felt responsible for that dog because it was only howling because of my cries. The guy I looked up to next to my father the most has just done the unthinkable. Now he's beaten his dog to death, unconscious, to ensure my silence. He dropped me off down at the lake, reiterated, don't you say a word. And I didn't want to be near the dam area where all the kids hung out. So I ran down the river with my bike. I ditched it in the weeds and I ran down the river. And I just was rocking along the river, hugging myself. And at that moment, my 12-year-old mind said, we are never going to talk about this. Talking about it is equal to reliving it, and we definitely don't want to relive what just happened. I had gotten a dirt bike for Christmas the previous year. And I wanted to avoid going down near the dam area at all costs. So I started hanging out. The rape occurred, the elementary school, Stillwater Elementary School, went up to 6th grade. They built a brand new high school a few years prior, and they put 7th and 8th grade in the high school. So I got raped the summer where I graduated elementary school and before I was going to start 7th grade. And to avoid the dam area, I started riding my dirt bikes with older kids around the lake. And they all smoked weed. And I began smoking weed on a weekly basis. I had no coping skills for the trauma in my brain, and I needed to dilute it somehow. And weed did that for me. If you had told me 3 months prior in 6th grade at the elementary school that I'd be smoking weed, I'd have laughed at you. It was so far out of my little brain's realm of possibility. And yet now I've been raped. I've had this dog beaten unconscious, dead in front of me. And I don't know how to process it. And I'm smoking weed on a regular basis. My mother worked at the new high school in the library. So every day I got to crank on my smile for her, for the teachers, for my classmates. I built up this big, outgoing personality and charm, and it was all a farce. It was just to fool everybody. I let my guard down one time. 7th grade in English class, we got given an assignment. The teacher gave each student a letter of the alphabet and said, you have to write a 1-page essay using that letter to start as many words as possible in your story. I got given the letter S, and I wrote about being a slave on a ship, where the shipmaster was a gay guy who every night would try to come into my bunk to molest me, and I had to keep a metal pipe at my side to beat him off with. This is what my essay was about. And it raised no red flags with the teacher. She gave me an A and said, use more paragraphs next time. And after that, I was sealed shut. If people look for signs in children of abuse, a few years earlier, I started playing with fire a lot, pouring gasoline on stuff, lighting it on fire. I lit our backyard on fire. I lit the corner of our house on fire. 7th grade, I get arrested. I get caught shoplifting cigars out of a store at the mall, our local mall. Those are both signs of sexual abuse, arson, and shoplifting. I came home from school and I thought I was real cute. I had a little safe in my room. But you could either use the combination to open it or you could just pull it real hard and it would open. And that's where I kept pot, rolling papers, and a bowl. And I come home and all 3 of those are sitting on my bed. And my father walks in behind me and he says, I am not putting up with this shit with you. I already researched a military school down by Philadelphia. You keep smoking that shit and I'll send you to military school. So he missed an opportunity to try to open up a dialogue with me about why the fuck I'm doing this. Why the fuck am I starting fires? Why am I shoplifting? Why am I smoking weed at 12 years old? Instead, back then, as was the norm, he took the authoritarian approach and he missed an opportunity to get me to open up. He did. About a year after the rape, sit me down and say, I want to ask you something. I'm hearing rumors about Dennis Pegg molesting inmates at the jail. He's like, he was taking inmates home to mentor them. And when he would get the inmates upon their release, young male inmates, obviously, when he would get them to his house, in the middle of the night, he would pounce on them. And some of these inmates ran out of his house and were hitchhiking in the Stillwater's a little town. And they were hitchhiking in the middle of the night in Stillwater, getting picked up by the residents and saying, this guy offered me a place to live to get my life back on track. In the middle of the night, he's on top of me trying to sexually molest me. And it spread around our town like wildfire, and my father caught wind of it. And he sat me down and he said, "Has Dennis ever touched you?" And this is really the only regret I have in life. I've led a really screwed up, wild life. But I uttered to him, "No, Daddy never touched me." I could have began healing right then if I just could have found the courage to open up. But back then, there was no agencies to treat abused children. The only ones you went to were the cops, and he was law enforcement. And I didn't know who to trust or who to turn to. So I said, "No, Daddy never touched me." About another year after that, my father went to the local Dunkin' Donuts in our town, and the waitress was from our town of Stillwater. And over a cup of coffee, she's telling my father how her son, who's a classmate of mine in the Boy Scouts, was raped by Dennis. My father comes home, tells me the story. And this time he says, "Before you answer my question, I just want you to know that you'll never have to talk to the police. You'll never have to testify in court. I will go take care of Dennis myself. You just tell me, has he ever touched you?" So is my father telling me he's going to murder Dennis? Go beat him up? I don't know. It's one of those two. And as tempting as it sounded, I just couldn't bring myself to tell my dad. And I said, "No, Daddy never touched me." I go into high school. Access to alcohol becomes much easier. And I become a heavy drinker in high school. I'm constantly at war with my parents. We used to go to keg parties in high school, me and my buddies, and get bottles of Yukon Jack. And it's a hard whiskey, and we're drinking Yukon Jack at parties and getting bombed. I got caught on class trips drinking. I came into school drunk, got suspended. The principal called me down to his office and said, "Clark, I just don't get you. You have unlimited opportunity and yet you squander it. Your grades are crap. You don't excel in sports. You don't do anything. What's going on with you?" And I felt like this bile starting to come up from my stomach through my chest, and it wanted out so bad. It wanted to just tell him what the fuck I've been dealing with. And it got up to here. And before it could come out, I swallowed it down. I just said, I don't know. I just shrugged my shoulders. I gave up. I abandoned. I knew I was smart. And I knew I could do no studying and get C's, maybe an occasional B, and that was fine with me. I abandoned my studies. I abandoned sports. I go off to college. Right after I graduate, a few weeks after I graduate high school, I get a drunk driving. I go off to college. I went to Northeastern University up in Boston, Mass. And I became a great student. I had college down to a science. I could study 4 nights out of the week, and I could be a blackout drunk 3 nights out of the week. I went to college back in the 80s where cocaine was like booming, and I tried coke for the first time, and I absolutely loved it. It took away my insecurities, my self-loathing. It made me outgoing. I tried other drugs, mushrooms, psychedelics in college, but it was really coke that I loved, coke and drinking. I met the love of my life. We dated. Northeastern's a 5-year school. We dated for 6 years. And when it was time for her to, when she was ready to take our relationship to the next level, she pinned me down and, wanted to start a life together. And I told her I couldn't. She goes, "What do you mean you can't?" I just said, "I can't." I couldn't be intimate. I could have sex all I wanted, but intimacy is a totally different thing. And I just couldn't do it. And she said, I gotta leave you then. And that haunted me for my whole life, that I missed out on her. My 20s, I never wanted to feel trapped, because trapped's how I felt when I was at Dennis Pegg's house. So I went from one career to another. I went from one relationship to another. I did one night stand after one night stand after one night stand. My whole thought process in my 20s was the pursuit of sex. If I could just sleep with enough women, that'll make me feel fulfilled and like a man, and take away all this self-hatred and self-loathing that I have. And it didn't work. After a decade of that, I went into my 30s just feeling empty, feeling like a big hole was within me. And I needed something else to push the pain and the shame back down. And I found that in gambling. When I walked into those casinos, I could literally check my pain and shame and self-hatred at the door. And I had an amazing run in the casinos for 5-6 years, winning huge amounts of money. And then I couldn't wait for the weekends. Like any other drug, you need more and more. I couldn't wait for the weekends. I needed a fix earlier in the week. So I started sports betting with the mob. Within 6 months, I was bankrupt, had to declare bankruptcy. And I got in debt to the mob for a large sum of money. From all my gambling winnings, I was putting so much cash into the bank, the IRS Criminal Investigation Bureau paid me a visit right to my house and did a full audit. My later 30s, I was importing steroids. I got a letter from Division of Homeland Security saying a package addressed to me got caught with anabolic steroids in it. And they basically give you a one-time get-out-of-jail-free card. So I've got all these things in my life. I had bought a Harley. I'm running with bikers. I'm selling drugs and doing drugs with 1% bikers. My life, which should have been full of potential, I'm just going down one dead-end street after another. I go into my 40s. When I went into my 30s, I was unemployed. Go figure. And my brother had a tire automotive business, and he asked me to join him, and we were going to open up a second shop, which we did. So I had nothing else to do, so I joined him. And I go into my 40s, and not knowing anything about PTSD, something triggers my PTSD, and I fall into a huge depression. And I don't know how to handle this depression. It was like this heavy, wet, soaking wet blanket on top of me that I couldn't get out from under. Just swinging my legs out of bed in the morning. Felt like I had these giant tree trunks. And I'd have to talk to myself like a little baby. Come on, Clark, come on, swing your other leg out. Come on now, stand up and walk to the bathroom. And not knowing how to combat this, I start drinking before work now. I start doing little bumps of Coke just to get me through my day. Working in the tire automotive, I would work on backhoe tires, loader tires, truck tires, and I herniated a disc in my back, and I went and saw a doctor. And he prescribed me 30 Vicodins. And I ate these 30 Vicodins in 3 days, and I felt like Superman on them. And I called him up, and I'm like, Doc, those pills worked wonders. I'm like, I feel like I'm 17 again, bro. Let's get some more. And he goes, whoa, that was a little fast there, buddy boy. He goes, I'll give you 10 more, and that's it. That simply wasn't acceptable to me. So I knew people on the street that I got Coke and stuff from. So I'm like, I'll just, in my mind, I'm like, I'll just find them on the street. and thus began a 6-year pain pill addiction. I was like a squirrel gathering nuts. I could have 500 pills in my drawer, and I'd still be worried because I heard this one time when Rush Limbaugh, after his back surgery, got addicted to pain pills. And I heard this astronomical number that he was taking 40 pain pills a day, and I just thought to myself, that's friggin' impossible. It's not impossible. I'm taking, depending on the strength of the pills I had, up to 2 dozen a day. So I'm severely depressed. I've got a pain pill addiction. I'm drinking before work. I'm doing bumps of coke. And one day after work, I'm in a deli getting a coffee, making a coffee at the island. And the door opens up. And I look up, and it's my rapist, Dennis Pegg. And he sees me, and he yells out to me like we're best friends, "Hey, Clark!" And I start instantly going into a panic attack. My heart's instantly racing 1,000,000 miles an hour, and my palms are sweaty, and my mind just starts swirling. And I feel my joints locking up like I did when I was a little kid when he would touch me. And walking in right behind him is a young boy about the age he raped me at. And that young boy calls him the same nickname he used to insist I call him. And I heard that nickname, and it just ripped open everything that I had repressed for the last 30 years. All my pain and horror and shame and rage and violence came instantly bubbling to the surface. And Dennis is starting to make his way to me, probably to give me a hug or a high five or a handshake, and I just ran right by him. We shoulder bumped. I ran right by him. I hopped in my pickup truck. I sped out of the parking lot. I started going down the road, flying down the road. I started punching my steering wheel, yelling, "Motherfucker!" I started spitting on my floor, and my life collapsed that day. Less than 2 months later, I walked out of the family business I was in with my brother. I could no longer swing my legs out of bed in the morning. It was like climbing Mount Everest, and I said, I'm fucking done climbing Mount Everest. And I never looked back. And now I got free time on my hands. I got pain and hatred and shame and rage bubbling out of me. For decades, all that filled my mind was hatred, rage, violence, pain, shame, pornography, drugs, alcohol. That's what I filled my mind with for decades. You fill your mind with that shit for decades, no good is going to happen in your life. And my life was about to take a left-hand turn south. Instead of buying a gram of Coke every now and then, I'm buying ounces of Coke a week. I'm using and selling. I got my pain pill addiction. People think that only the degenerates do heroin, that only the homeless people on the street do heroin. Drugs will lie to you. Drugs don't care who they go after. When my pain pills started running low and people didn't have any, somebody said, I got some dope, man. It's a hell of a lot better than pain pills and a hell of a lot cheaper. And I'm like, fuck it. And I start doing heroin. From the age of 12, when I started smoking weed on a weekly basis, I began blowing through all my boundaries I set in life. That rape, the bumping logs, the wrestling with a hard-on on top of me, all that shit made me so I couldn't live within my boundaries anymore. Boundaries became meaningless. And now I've just blown through another boundary. I told myself I would never, ever, ever, ever do heroin. And now I'm doing heroin. I'm doing so much cocaine that I'm popping 8 to 12 Xanax a day. I'm drinking massive amounts of alcohol. I don't care if I live or die. So many nights in the middle of the night, I couldn't remember how many Xanax I popped. I'm like, my heart's racing so from the coke. I'm like, should I pop more Xanax? Shouldn't I? Should I take some pain pills instead? How many pain pills have I taken? I'm like, I'd just be like, whatever, bro. And one night, I had told a friend, I had lent money to a friend, and he was coming over he was going to pay back the money by power washing and staining the cedar siding of my house. And the morning he was going to come over on June the 12th. I woke up that morning after a 3-day coke bender. I passed out for maybe 2 hours. Did a line of coke, poured a glass of wine, sat in bed, put on the news, and it was the start of Jerry Sandusky's molestation trial. Jerry Sandusky was a coach out at Penn State, and he'd been running a boys' camp and molesting all these boys for decades. And I saw this guy getting out of his lawyer's car and buttoning his suit jacket, and I just started yelling curses at the TV. I started spitting on my bedroom floor. I just was hugging myself and rocking back and forth on my bed. And I was, at this point, I'm doing so much drugs. I'm avoiding family, I'm avoiding friends. But that day, seeing that trial, I had to get out of my house. I spent the rest of the day out, drinking, doing coke, popping Xanax. I stopped at an Italian restaurant I always frequented, and there was a guy in there who had burned me on a business deal. And he and I had words. And then I went home to meet my friend who was dropping off the equipment to power wash and stain the house. And I told him about seeing the guy who burned me on the business deal in the restaurant. And we're having a glass of wine at my kitchen table. And my friend says, that guy's got to be number 1 on your hit list. And before I could stop the words, I couldn't control my mouth. I said, he's actually number 2 on my hit list. The piece of shit who raped me as a kid is number 1. And there's dead silence. My friend's just staring at me. And for the first time in my life, I've never told anybody about the rape. I just let it out. My friend starts asking me some questions. Who is he? Where does he live? And within 15 minutes, we're driving to his house to go confront him. I'm like, let's confront this motherfucker. I look from outside his house in, ran up his driveway. His front door was open. His storm screen door was shut. And there he was sitting there watching TV. It's 9:30 at night. He doesn't have a care in the world. I start going into that panic attack again. I feel my joints just, it's like a paralysis comes over you. Even 30 years later, that guy still had that power over me. And before I could freeze in his driveway, I marched up to that screen door and I ripped it open. And here I am, a childhood rape victim of his, who's just ripped open his screen door at 9:30 at night. And this fucking whack job looks over his shoulder, calmly as can be, and goes, "Hey, how are you?" And it just seemed like the most bizarre thing in the world to say. He didn't like get on his knees and start pleading or say, "I'm sorry, I always thought you might come by here. Let's talk. He just says, hey, how are you? I go, hey, how am I, motherfucker? Let me show you how the fuck I am. And I raced across this fucking living room, and I had a knife in my hand, and I started stabbing at him. And he started throwing haymakers at me. And a violent, bloody struggle ensued. At one point, he connected with a shot squarely to my jaw, and I started falling down. And I grabbed his shirt with my left hand to hold myself up. And I came down I yelled, you motherfucker, and I came down with the knife, and I put the knife straight through my hand, and I severed all the ligaments and tendons in it. The fight lasted just a couple minutes. He fell down in blood. And I knelt down in front of him. And I looked him in the eye, and I said, it's not so fun raping little boys now, is it? And I slit his throat. And people always want to ask me, did all your problems disappear when you did that? And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? I'm like, to go murder, even though I murdered a pedophile, to go murder somebody, I had to get down in the gutter like a dog. No, it didn't cure all my problems. It just added a whole nother dimension of problems to my already mountainous problems I had. And before I left that house, in my bloody footprints, I walked over to the bedroom he raped me in, and I spit on his bed. I was arrested the next day. I woke up the next morning in bed. And when I opened my eyes, I said, what the fuck have you done, Clark? You just flushed your fucking life down the toilet, bro. In my mind, that was so polluted with drugs and alcohol, said if we could just get some drugs and alcohol in our system, we can come up with a plan. And like a lunatic, I yelled out to my empty bedroom, I agree. And I got up. I poured a bunch of Xanax into my hand. I took them. I went out to my kitchen. I poured a glass of wine, and I look out the window, and my street is lined with at least a dozen cop cars. I'm like, are you fucking kidding me already? And my stomach just dropped to the ground. I chugged that glass of wine. I poured another one. I walked out to the slider in the back of the house, and I looked out the back, and there's cops hiding behind trees, behind rock walls. And I'm like, what the fuck? And out of a loudspeaker, I hear, Mr. Fredericks, come out of your house with your hands up. And one thing I did, I had seen a state trooper friend of mine from high school a few months prior in a bar, and he's like, hey, come out to the car. I got some hats and some state police shirts. Take a couple. I'm like, oh, yeah, cool. Before I go walking out, I go into my bedroom and I put my state police shirt on. I'm like, this should get me out of it. I knew it wouldn't get me out of it, but I just thought, fuck it. If I'm getting arrested by the state police, I might as well get arrested wearing their shirt. And as I started walking to my front door, I called out to God who at 12, my relationship with God changed at 12. It became a relationship of me getting into the riskiest behaviors and calling out to God, you owe me, bro. I'm doing drug deals with people from Patterson buying ounces of coke. And I'm like, you owe me, bro. You better get me through this. That was my relationship with God. And I said to God as I was walking to that front door, I'm like, God, please let one of these cops shoot me when I step out my front door. Just let it be over. I'm done with this life. It's over, bro. And I stepped out onto my front porch. I put my hands out, and I waited for the crack of a gun just so I would know I'd be out of my misery, and I never heard that crack of the gun. Instead, I was taken to the state police barracks. And when I was in the state police barracks, this lieutenant came in to the holding cell, and the first words out of his mouth were, "I want to apologize to you." I go, "What the hell are you apologizing to me for?" And he goes, "I've known about this scumbag for a long, long time." And he goes, "And I apologize that I could never arrest him." He goes, "I can't build a criminal case based on rumors and innuendos. I need cold, hard facts, and I need victims. And whatever he did to you victims to keep you silent prevented me from arresting him. And I apologize." And he left the cell, and I was like, wow. At first I felt good, about him apologizing. And then I just started fuming. I'm like, every fucking person knew about this scumbag, and yet I got to be the one to put an end to him. And now I just flushed my life down the toilet. Why the fuck did I have? Every single person around knew what Dennis Pegg was doing with young boys. And yet I got to be the one to put an end to his 45-year reign of terror, and I got to pay with my life. A little while later, that same lieutenant came back into the holding cell. And he goes to me, he goes, "Look, dude." He goes, "My detectives are waiting in another room with detectives from the prosecutor's office, and they're waiting to interrogate you. You're going to get pulled out of here in a minute or two. If you go into that room and open your mouth, you could totally fuck your whole life." He goes, "You're in deep shit right now. You don't need to get in deeper shit. You go into that room, you exercise your Fifth Amendment rights, you keep quiet, you request a lawyer, and you don't say another word." And he asked me 3 times, "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And I'm like, "I got it." And without him telling me that, I might have just, he said to me later on, "I could tell you had mailed in your life." I walked back in that holding cell, and I could just see the look in your eyes that your life was done. And it was. I righted a wrong for a lot of people, including myself, and I just forfeited the rest of my life. And this guy didn't want my life to be forfeited. So I went into that interrogation room, I requested a lawyer, and that was the end of the interview. I had to get emergency hand surgery. And under the anesthesia, as soon as I came out of it, they took me to the jail. And I woke up in the middle of the night, not knowing where I was. And eventually, after surveying my surroundings, it came to me that I was in the county jail. Where they put me was in a suicide cell. And I was in that suicide cell for 4 weeks. And they had me in the right spot, because at that point I just wanted to die. I had no desire to keep living. I had no desire to do life in prison. And now I'm in the very jail. You want to talk about how low somebody can sink? I'm in the very jail being held for murder of a lieutenant who spent his whole career working in that jail. And it seemed like he had been protected. So I'm thinking, they're going to give me the beating of a lifetime in this place. And one by one, the guards that would come in to do cell checks in that suicide cell would be like, "Hey, look, man, keep your mouth shut. Don't talk to anybody. I'm hearing a lot of shit about this guy. I didn't know him. I didn't work with him. I'm hearing he was an animal. Just keep your mouth shut." Next guy would come in and say something similar. My 3rd day there, a guard came in who I knew from the street. And he's like, "My man, how are you?" And I go, "Are you fucking kidding me, bro?" I'm like, "I'm shitty." He's like, I know. He goes, "Do you know what's going on in the community?" I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Somebody started a Free Clark campaign." He's like, "There's bumper stickers everywhere." He goes, "Every fucking car has a Free Clark sticker on it." And I'm like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah." I go, "They don't view me as a monster?" He's like, "Are you fucking kidding me? Peg was the monster. Everybody wants to know why he was still walking the street." I was like, man. The sheriff's department, when they have a fallen comrade, they lower the flag to half-mast. and they wear blue ribbons. They were ordered not to lower the flag to half-mast for Dennis Pegg and not to wear blue ribbons. That should tell you what they were hearing about him. I finally, after 4 weeks in the suicide cell, I had to go to 3 weeks in an isolation cell because I had a cast on and they viewed that as a weapon. And they wouldn't allow me into general population with my cast on. So until that cast came off, I was in a cell by myself, isolated. I finally get put up into general population. And there's these overhead lights that come on in your cell that like shock you awake at shift change in the morning. They come on and they literally are so bright and have such an evil hum to them. They shock you awake. And I would wake up every morning cursing my existence, cursing where I was, cursing that light. And I called out to God that day. I had been unable to pray. Anytime I tried to close my eyes to pray, just violent images or sexual images would flood my mind. So instead, I yelled out to God that day in my cell. I said, God, you either have to help me find a way to kill myself or heal myself. I can't go on another day feeling like this. And like I said, I was not a Bible toter. I had abandoned God. And yet, that day in my cell, I heard an internal voice loud and clear say, you have to pick up a book and start reading. My case had been all over the country. It was on the front page of the LA Times, Baltimore Sun, all over. It aired in 37 countries around the world. I got books, self-help books, spiritual books, meditation books, yoga books, the Bible. Books from all over the country were coming into me. You can only keep so many books in your cell. Almost every cell on my tier had my books in them. And when I heard that voice say, you have to pick up a book and start reading, I looked at the books in my cell. And there was one tiny little book. And I took that book, which I had never even paid attention to, and it was Man's Search for Meaning by Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. And I said, well, it's a small book. I'll start with this one. And in it, he talked about finding purpose in life and meaning in life, even in the circumstance of being in a concentration camp. And there was a sentence in there that ignited something in me. The sentence was, I'm gonna paraphrase it. When you're faced with an intolerable situation that will not change, you must change yourself. And I read that and I'm like, all right, my situation isn't gonna change. I could possibly do life in prison. I gotta change myself. And I read that line over and over and over. I highlighted it and I would just read. When your situation isn't gonna change, you have to change yourself. And I dedicated myself after reading that line to begin healing. There's no therapist in jail. There's a therapist, but it's just to prescribe drugs. And my lawyer said, don't say anything to the therapist because the prosecutor can get her records. So I'm like, all right. So I had no one to talk to in there. But I decided I was going to start healing. I just began reading and reading and reading. And I would take maybe one thing out of a book and apply it to myself. I read this book, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And this book was about taking back control of your mind, using mindfulness. If you had told me when I'm riding Harleys, doing lines of coke, going into strip clubs, selling drugs to one percenters, that I'm going to read a book called The Power of Now about mindfulness and it's going to change my life, I would have backhanded you and said, get out of here. And yet I read that book and I almost underlined the whole thing. Sometimes I could only get through a couple pages. It was a heavy book and it was deep and I wanted to absorb it. And I wanted to take back control of my mind because for 24/7, my mind either was focusing on the past abuse and the murder, or it was facing life in prison. So I read and I read and I read, and I finally picked up the Bible and I read the Bible front to back. After 3 years of sitting in the county jail, I got offered a plea deal. Enough other victims came forward, but they didn't want to. And the prosecutor even said in court one day, and this is sort of funny, that I'm in the jail for murder where the guy worked his whole career, and yet the prosecutor's telling the judge, I don't think I can get a fair trial, Your Honor. Coming to work every day, I'm seeing free Clark stickers on cars. How am I going to get an impartial jury? So they finally gave me a plea deal to second-degree manslaughter, which carries 5 to 10 years. About my 4th month of incarceration, my mother came for a visit at the jail. And while she was standing in line to come see me, her minister walked out of the jail. He had been in to see some other kid that his parents asked him to go visit their son, and he went to see him. He saw my mother, and he gave her a hug, and then he grabbed her by the shoulders. And he looked at her eye to eye, and he said, Joan, I want you and your son to start praying on the number 5 as in a 5-year sentence. My mother came in for the visit, and she tells me the story about praying for the number 5. And this is like my 4th month that I was locked up. I'm facing life. I'm suicidal. I'm depressed. And I say to her, Mom, you got to pick a number that's a little more realistic. A 5 is not going to happen. And she said to me, son, I believe in God. I believe in miracles. And I want you to start believing in them too. And I knew I was putting her through a lot of pain. And I said, all right, Mom, I will. And from that day forward, I started praying on the number 5. I started asking God for a 5-year sentence. I started meditating. I read all these books on meditation. And I started putting a 5 into my meditation. I read books on using a mantra to quiet your mind. And I would put a 5 into the mantra I repeated all day long in my mind. I'm repeating this mantra. So now fast forward to accepting this plea deal. And my lawyer prepared me that when we eventually go for sentencing, he's like, no judge, especially on a murder case, is going to want to be on the low end. They're going to want to be on the high end of the scale. So just prepare yourself. And I'm like, all right. I finally go for sentencing. And in court, on the record, the judge gives me a 5 and apologizes for having to send me to prison for a single day. He says, I know that you only did what you did because of what was done to you. And when I got taken out of that court and put back in the holding cell, it just dawned on me that I got the 5 that I'd been praying on, that I scoffed at my mother for. And I couldn't believe that the impossible became possible. I went to prison at Northern State Prison in Newark, New Jersey. In my first day there, a therapist came to my cell and said, I followed your case on the news, and I just saw your name come across the computer. I can't believe you're here. She goes, will you start therapy? And I said, absolutely. I had to finally surrender. I resisted change my whole life. I thought I was a big, bad, tough guy. I'll just do things my way. And my way didn't work, obviously. And I finally decided to surrender and to let anything and everything come into my life that could take my life in a new direction. I had no desire to go back to the animal I had been. So here I have to go to prison to get therapy for the first time in my life. And my second one-on-one therapy with her, she said, I run a group therapy class in prison for childhood trauma. Would you join that? And I said, sure. And I'm in there with Latin King gang members, blood gang members, Muslims, Christians, and we all had these fucked up childhoods. And we're all sharing our story in front of each other. And we're crying in front of each other. And we're hugging each other. And that group therapy class was the greatest healer I could have ever got in. So as shitty as prison is, at least I got that group therapy class under my belt. My therapist also came to me one day and she said, I can't believe it, Clark. For the first time in a New Jersey prison, they're going to offer a meditation class. It's a 15-week Vipassana meditation class. She goes, there's limited seats. I want you to sign up and maybe you'll get in. So I signed up for it. And I was one of 15 people to get in. For 2.5 hours on a Friday night while you got all this insanity swirling around you, I'd be in a classroom getting to do meditation quietly and calmly. I got released from prison on December 30th of 2016, so basically the first of the year of 2017. And I had led this selfish, indulgent lifestyle, and I still had a little bit of selfish in me. And when I say that because I decided I wanted to file a lawsuit against the Boy Scouts, and I went and saw a law firm, and they read me the law, New Jersey law, and the guy said, as the law states, you have no recourse for a lawsuit. And he goes, there's advocates who have been working for 15 years to get a new law and they haven't gotten anywhere yet. Maybe you can join them and your story's so over the top that you can sway some senators and Congress people to pass a new law. And I'm like, yeah. He goes, I got the numbers of the advocates. I'll set up a meeting here in my office. I'm like, cool. So I went in for selfish reasons, just for myself. And I walked out of there becoming an advocate for everyone in the state who had been abused. I started meeting with senators, lawyers for the Catholic Church. I got to testify before the House Judicial Committee. And 2 years after becoming an advocate and people telling us you will never get a new law passed in New Jersey, we went from the worst law in the country to the strongest law. 2 years of being an advocate. I was in Trenton, New Jersey to see the final vote, and it was voted in unanimously. When I was locked up in prison, I heard that internal voice for the second time as I sat in my cell quietly one day, loud and clear, saying to me, you're going to become a motivational speaker. And I had been afraid, deathly afraid of getting up in front of people and speaking. In college, I'm doing shots of vodka at 8 o'clock in the morning before I got to go do reports in front of the class. And I think it was because I had all this shit, all this garbage inside of me that I'm carrying around. Like, how can I stand up in front of people? They're gonna see all this crap. They're gonna see that I'm a fraud. And yet I heard that voice say, you're gonna be a motivational speaker. And I threw up my hands. I'm like, whatever. And I thought to myself, how's a dude coming out of prison for murder ever gonna get a motivational speaking career going? Less than 2 months out of prison, before I became an advocate, one of the pastors who used to come into the jail and teach Bible study said, you got to come to my church. He wrote me when I was in prison. He's like, you got to come see my church. It's a huge church. And when I went to see him, he's like, we're doing a water baptism. And he goes, we're baptizing people in tubs that were made by New Jersey prisoners. He goes, how ironic would that be for you to get baptized in a tub made by your fellow prisoners? And I'm like, that'd be pretty cool. Let's do it. And I had to read this testimony in front of like a congregation of like 500 about why I was getting baptized. And in the audience was this lady from a place called Ginny's House. And Ginny's House is for abused children. And she heard my testimony and she reached out to me. And she said, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I'm presenting at Centenary College. Would you like to be my guest speaker? And I was like, absolutely. So here, less than 4 months out of prison, where I had no idea I'd ever become a motivational speaker, this door is getting opened by God for me. And from the time the law got passed in New Jersey, I concentrated more on speaking. I spoke in rehab center after rehab center after rehab center. I spoke at churches. I went back to the jail where I had been held for murder for 3.5 years and got to speak to the inmates there. A director of a play, off-Broadway play, called Blackbird, based on molestation, reached out to me and asked if I'd be guest speaker after the play on stage. And I'm like, absolutely. Twice I went and spoke on stage after the play ended. NBC did a documentary on me. The producers of NBC did a documentary on my case. And I got on the Tamron Hall daytime talk show. And from being on that talk show, I got offered a speaking contract by a firm out of LA who wanted to represent me as a speaker. So that little voice I heard in that prison cell saying you're going to be a motivational speaker, and again, I scoffed at it, sort of just threw my hands up. Here, a few years down the road, I just get offered a contract by a speaking firm. And I share this stuff to try to give people hope. That's the one thing that always kept me going. People are like, how have you survived all the shit you've survived? And I'm like, I always held on to that little glimmer of hope. I went through life without any purpose, without any meaning. All I was trying to do was just stay one step ahead of my pain. And now, helping other victims open up, helping them speak out, letting them know they're not alone. I always felt alone in the world, like nobody else could understand the pain I was carrying inside. Well, there's a hell of a lot of people who understand the pain I'm carrying inside. And I always held on to hope, and that always kept me going. If you can just retain a little bit of hope, it can keep you motivated. And I stayed motivated. When I was locked up, I wrote a manuscript of the first half of my life, and I dreamed of like getting a book deal. And I wrote 3 book proposals and got nowhere with them. And out of the blue, Simon & Schuster read my last book proposal and just offered me a contract, which I just signed a few weeks ago for a book deal. I just finished up a multi-episode documentary. A producer reached out to me and said, your story's amazing, it's inspiring. I want to give your voice to other people to help them open up. And we just finished up this multi-episode documentary, filming it. And that college sweetheart who I lost 30 years ago, who I hated myself that I couldn't commit to her, I couldn't take the next step with her. After 30 years, I finally reached out to her to apologize, to tell her why I couldn't commit to her. She used to say to me, we'd be lying in bed together and I would just stare off into the distance. And she would be like this, and there would be nothing. And she'd be like, hey. I'd be like, what? She goes, where'd you just go? I'm like, what are you talking about? She goes, you just left me. She's like, where'd you disappear in your mind to? And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So she always knew there was something troubling me, but didn't know what it was. And I had reached out to her and explained my story, explained how I finally had meaning and purpose to help others now. I explained all the good I was doing with my life. I'm 10 years sober. And we got together for coffee 2 weeks after I reached out to her, and we fell madly back in love. So I just want people to realize that, I sunk to where I was suicidal. I was held in a suicide cell for 4 weeks. I was put into jail for murder, for murdering a lieutenant who worked in that very jail. It doesn't get much worse than that. And yet, a few years down the road, by holding on to hope and by taking chances and not caring if I failed and throwing as much mud against the wall as I possibly could, one thing after another started coming through in my life. And now, just the opportunity to reach people on a large scale and get them to open up. When people hear my story, they relate to it. You relate to people that have been through the same fire as you. And breaking your silence is the first step to healing. And I don't mind throwing all my garbage out to the world if it'll help the next person break their silence. I learned this line in therapy. It's from the AA Blue Book, but it's so true. It says, we are only as sick as our secrets. I had secrets up to my chin, and I was sick. I was sick inside. So speak out, break your silence. Don't hold secrets in, and let's begin healing. Thank you.